Es geht weiter mit The Future of the News. Es kann sein, von einem Tornado wird ein Dach abgerissen oder eine Demonstration eskaliert. In einem Bürgerkriegsland wie in Syrien gibt es eine Schießerei. Das sind häufig Momente, in denen keine TV-Kamera vor Ort ist. Das sind Momente, in denen jeder Bürger vielleicht sein Smartphone zückt und das, was er gesehen hat, auf Facebook oder Twitter online stellt. Das Ganze verändert natürlich die Nachrichtenwelt. Wie umgehen mit diesem User-Generated Content? Darüber diskutieren heute in hochkarätiger Runde. Zum einen Richard Porter von BBC Global News, Rowan Barnett von Twitter Germany, Benjamin Ruth, Geschäftsführer von Vice Media, Mans Adler, Gründer von Bambuser, und das Ganze wird moderiert von John Götz. Er ist selber Investigativjournalist beim NDR und der Süddeutschen Zeitung. The stage is yours. Come up.
So, welcome, and thank you for coming in such big numbers. We're hoping to make this as lively as possible, and I wanted to first of all introduce the panelists, and then each person is going to answer some questions and come out with a thesis about the future of the news, the crowd versus the editor. I would like to introduce Richard Porter first from the BBC. He is now the controller of English at BBC Global News. He began his career working for newspapers, was at the BBC World Service for many years, if I'm right, and is a representative of the kind of public television that is very interested in using also new media in what it does. Next, I'd like to introduce Benjamin Ruth, from the CEO of Vice Media Germany. He is originally from Munich, if I'm...
Frankfurt.
Frankfurt, okay.
Big.
Has lived in Germany for about, actually lived in Berlin for about 10 years, and is basically responsible for the German branding of the Vice magazine as well as Vice website. Studied in Spain and the UK. Right? Mans Adler is Swedish and is the founder of Bambuser, which I'm sure most people know of, which basically provides the capability of people to give live feed from situations all around the world. And much of the footage that they provided from Syria and from other crises have been used in the BBC and in the ARD and in other broadcasters. So it'll be interesting to hear from him. And last but not least is Rowan Barnett, the director of marketing and development at Twitter Germany. You originally come, if I'm right, from Bild, is that right? Bild.de, and have been at Twitter since 2008, is that right?
No, 2012.
2012, okay. So, Richard Porter, maybe you could begin, if you could give some concrete examples from your everyday working environment, how the news production, distribution, verification, and consumption are changing with things like Twitter and Bambuser.
Okay, I'll start by making 3 quick points, really. My first point is, I don't really accept the question, the crowd versus the editor. I think we're on the same side, as opposed to being against each other. I think, as a starting point, the reason we exist is to serve the audience, and the crowd is the audience. So I don't think you can start from the crowd versus the editor. But we have within the BBC worked very hard to take advantage of the opportunities offered by our ability now to get real-time information from the audience, and also to deliver on what is a very clear demand from the audience to see what they're saying, what they're offering, being integrated into the day-to-day fabric of news production. And so we have everything in the BBC has initials. We have something called the UGC Hub, User-Generated Content. It's a team of people which has grown steadily over the years, whose job is specifically to work with audiences on getting information which helps us to improve our storytelling and to speed up our storytelling and picture gathering and all the things that everybody knows about that we can do. We spend a lot of time working on verification, and I'm sure that's something we'll talk about during this session this morning. That's very important to us. Verification is just a way of describing something that journalists have been doing forever, really, which is receiving information and checking it out, and if they think it's right, putting it on air or in print or whatever. So that's my first point, really, which is, the crowds and the editor, we're on the same side, we're trying to do the same thing, and we're trying to serve that audience. That's our purpose.
But Metis, have job profiles changed between?
Some have, yeah. So we have a group of people, that's their job, that's what they do. In fact, pretty much every journalist working in the BBC newsroom is using new platforms to interact with the audience. There are many, many programs that I know of that are doing guest booking now by using Twitter or whatever as a way of contacting people, or putting out appeals for people to contact them with information that's relevant to the story. But something else I want to say is that this is a very important area to discuss, but it's kind of not everything. Actually, there's a lot of people out there for whom consuming media in traditional ways is still what they need from us. And in that case, what they need for us is to process information that we receive and to put it on air. But they are not the people who are also engaging with us. They just want to consume it, and we mustn't lose sight of that very, very large section of the audience as we rush to take advantage of the new things that are happening. And for the BBC's services internationally, we still have more people coming to us on radio than we do on any other platform. And in fact, the fastest growth area for us is still in television. And I think it's important to remember that that's what the audience is doing in very large numbers still. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion. And my third and final point, and just to make it very briefly, is that I think something that's really important in this discussion is trust, actually. And I think we put a lot of effort into finding out what audiences think of BBC content. And our view is that if audiences trust us more, they will come to us more often. And so that's a really important factor in some of the decisions we make, that we don't want to make mistakes. Can't avoid them, but we don't want to make mistakes. We want to be as accurate and responsible as possible in our journalism. And if the audiences trust us, they will reward us with their time. And a piece of evidence that I would cite as us being trusted in this world is that the BBC is the most tweeted URL according to Newswhip, and by some vast margin. And that's a kind of measure that we take very seriously, actually. Not just what is the size of the audience, is what do they think of us, and that's one way in which we would measure that.
Thanks very much. Benjamin Ruth, if you can give us some examples of kind of how editor, correspondent, journalist is different than older media or public television, or how is Vice different?
I think Vice is different in many ways. First of all, I don't like so much the comparison between old and new media. I think the discussion that we have to have goes along different lines about how we sort of distribute and how we produce content. And I think this is also where the differences for Vice are being found. Is, from a distribution point of view, we very much incorporate all platforms that are available. It's content first, but we see distribution not only as means of pushing content out, but also in creating conversation with our audience. And I think this is where the whole discussion, the crowd versus the editor, becomes very important. I think versus is the wrong word here. It's more a sort of congenial, very productive relationship that the crowd has with the editor. But coming back to Vice, from a content production point of view, of course, we speak to a younger audience, and this audience has a different agenda. It speaks a different language. It is, it grew up in different times. They embrace technology in their everyday life, and these are all aspects which we incorporate into the ways of how we produce news. And the takeaway points here is really the young agenda that we want to, produce for, and the tonality and the relevant challenge that we're using.
Great, great. Mans Adler, how are the tools that Bambuser is providing used for crowd-based news production? And how are media companies, when using the source internet, dealing with the question of content verification? I mean, how does that enter into your daily working life?
I mean, the use cases are of course, very varied. When we set out to sort of want to democratize the tool of broadcasting, where everybody with a cell phone would be able to live stream video from wherever, I think it also takes a stand on where the difference between new and old is in the sense of the business model. Traditional media has a business model based around a very high production cost, which needed sort of to serve a lowest common denominator. So you could attract money from advertising or in the other public sectors sort of to get the high production cost paid for. Whereas when we are sort of distribution our democratic tools and it's a small marginal cost, that makes a huge difference because everybody can do it. And that also makes a change in which kind of audience you need to attract, because the father of the 11-year-old daughter can all of a sudden watch his daughter playing soccer, and he doesn't need only to see the Bundesliga, right? So those use cases is kind of different, but when it comes to the more integration that we do with the larger media companies like BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera and so on, it's a lot about people with a cell phone on a rooftop in Syria shooting images when Assad forces bomb Homs or something like that. Images that BBC doesn't, the cost of sending a journalist in there is just the cost of sending them there is so high that they can't deal with it. So this is a cheap way of going around it.
I mean, I remember the fall of the wall, being here as a journalist, and when, I think it was November 11th that NBC arrived, or maybe it was November 10th, with Tom Brokaw, and they set up some huge stage in Brandenburg Gate, and it took them hours to build it up so he could stand there and do his stand-ups. I mean, it's really a very different world now.
Yeah.
Rowan Barnett, what is Twitter's role regarding the question of how news production, distribution, verification, and consumption are going? I mean, there are, of course, some fake Twitter feeds, but I know of it as one of the most important tools that journalists use, simply also just to read the newspaper, just to find out what's going on. I mean, it's a different way that people have access to news. And in some ways, I mean, you have this formula, which is interesting. It's this whole Tom Sawyer thing, charging someone to paint the fence for you. I mean, that there are other people, and there are many people out there that are willing to scan the media for me and post what they think is important. So it's really quite an interesting model.
Yeah, of course. And Twitter is obviously a platform for both the crowd and the editor. And Twitter plays really an essential role in this whole process of producing, consuming, distributing the news. And in fact, what we've seen really is how Twitter has become a platform where it enables anyone to share the news, to produce the news, and distribute it in real time, publicly, and to a global audience. And so that really has become the foundation of Twitter really being the place where news breaks. And of course, if you think back at some of the major news stories of the 20th century, you heard about them on TV, you heard about them in newspapers. And looking back at some of the major stories of the last few years, starting particularly with one of the watershed moment, I think, for Twitter was the landing of that plane on the Hudson River. which was captured by Janice Crumbs, who only had 200 followers at the time, and yet, he sent out that photo, and it got distributed around the world. And you think of the Arab Spring, you think of the Boston bombings, and in fact, any kind of breaking news situation around the world, invariably you'll find that the first eyewitness accounts, the tweets, the photos, will take place first on Twitter. And so it's become obviously an essential tool for journalists, become an essential tool for newsrooms, and I think that Twitter really plays a very important role for newsrooms and gives them value on every step of that, of that news production consumption chain. So, Twitter gives the unique, possibility for newsrooms to engage with users. It gives them unique possibilities as a reporter to do live reporting and have that integrated on my site in real time. It gives them unique possibilities to reach out to anyone in the world, when something's happening, to use the tools that we provide to find, tweets and photos, to get in touch with those eyewitnesses. And of course, it provides a unique value proposition around distribution and driving traffic back to your own site.
But there's a good example. I mean, I can't remember how many tweets of the photos of the Russian buildup on the Ukraine border. There were NATO photos that were put out, and I don't know, zillions of people tweeted Russian buildup on the border, and you could look at the photos. And we did a funny thing, is that we called NATO's press office and asked them about the pictures. And it was really quite, we didn't end up running the story because it wasn't big enough, but they distanced themselves from the photos. They said, oh, well, they're from a satellite company, and they provided the captions, and we're not even sure if the photos are correct. I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't a Russian buildup. I mean, but those photos were not verified by anyone, and they were tweeted by everyone at the same time. Yeah, Benjamin.
And I think that the Twitter case and how we define news is a very interesting example, because Twitter is great for information, but where news agencies and news companies, media companies actually come in is interpreting this information. It's about opinion, it's about analysis, it's about verification. And I can all give you like a very recent example of one of our correspondents who was held captive in Ukraine. Luckily, it all worked out positively. But the information about him being captured was first released. We knew that he was being captured, but publicly it was first released on Twitter by people who were there. But it was just information. It wasn't really sort of interpreted. Only when we decided to go public with that information as it was going around on Twitter, we put the whole information into context of what actually really happened. And there you see the importance of, sticking to the title of this discussion here, you see the importance of the editor. Because we have a zillion cameramen out there on YouTube, and we have a zillion of other sort of mini correspondents out there, and they all provide us with information. But our role as a media company, as a news agency, is putting this information into context, verifying it and putting it into context, analyzing it and putting opinion on it. And that's when information becomes actually really valuable for the wider public.
I think just on that note, sort of how a lot of the news agency move from Twitter is sort of understanding, as you said, it's information, and you see that something going on. A very specific example is on the 25th of January, when the Arab Spring takes off in Cairo. The Swedish public broadcaster sort of picked it up on Twitter, but they weren't sure enough. I mean, a lot of people were writing, and there's 100,000 people on Tahrir Square, a revolution is happening, but it couldn't verify it, right? It was very hard to verify until, the thousands of videos that we had in real time, they could move over to our platform, check it out, start interacting with people, and real time is kind of hard to fake because it's happening right here, right now on our planet. So with an integrated chat, they start chatting and saying, could you film to the right just to make sure that this is happening right here, right now? And with the GPS location, you can verify, you can identify buildings that it's actually happening and see people and so on. So,
right. I mean, of course we can verify if it's actually happening, but then, of course, there's the danger of staged events, right? We're government staged events. I mean, if we all think of that that thing that I think we probably all watched when Saddam Hussein's statue fell with the American flag and all of that. I mean, to what extent? I mean, sure, that footage was accurate. It happened, but was it verified in the sense of was it actually a real spontaneous uprising? It took many years for a lot of us to look at those images differently.
Well, it takes good journalists. It takes good journalists to verify, and it's the problem you just mentioned is not a problem of recent years. It has been happening, you know, in the beginning of the Second World War. It has been happening many years before. There were always sort of manipulated propaganda type of staged events, but it takes good journalism to investigate, to understand these.
Richard.
I think we might spend the next 45 minutes agreeing about most things. Actually, I think that you know, the crowd, we need that. That's you know, the examples we were given there from Egypt. That is a vital part of the news gathering process. But we also need journalists still, and you know, speaking up for big media, as it were. You know, the best way of finding out whether something's happening in Tahrir Square is having one of your own journalists standing there. And ideally, they're somebody who lives there, and they speak the right language wherever they happen to be, and they've got the experience of covering that story, and they still have an awful lot to offer. And that's pretty central to our strategy, that we maintain, to the extent that we can, with the economics that we have, the widest network of correspondence possible. So I'm very much in admiration of what Vice has been doing in Ukraine recently, but that's basically one guy. You know, if you're lucky that you've got a Ukrainian service and you have a Russian service and you have English language correspondence based in Kiev before all of this gets going, then that's a huge advantage in being able to tell an authentic story of what's going on. And there are many situations, in particular breaking news situations, where the crowd, as we call it, comes into play and has shifted the way in which the story develops. But there are also very many situations where what you're seeing and reading and hearing on the news is the result of somebody who is doing just very traditional journalism in the way that we're all familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why a lot of media outlets also rely on the crowd is because they can't afford to have a huge network of correspondents, right?
Well, as I say, we're all limited by how much money we've got. The approach we take is the thing we protect the most is the people out there in the field. That's where a lot of our investment goes. And even though we've had to make savings in the BBC in recent years, as has pretty much every news organization, that's the thing we've tried to protect the most. Actually, I don't think it's right, though, to say that the use of the audience is because it saves money. I don't think you can draw that line. It is fantastically useful to be able to receive a picture from New York instantly of a plane that's sitting in the Hudson River. But when I first saw that picture, I didn't think, oh, great, that's saved us a few $1,000s in news gathering fees. I thought, oh my God, you know. Yeah.
But then in the case, for example, in Syria, I think we're getting to a point where the insurance cost for BBC of sending a journalist in there is so high that you can't afford it, and then we miss out if we're not sort of.
Well, no, to be clear, we still have people in Syria. We've had people. On the rebel side, we had a fantastic report from a guy called Ian Pannell last week, who has been in and out into the most dangerous areas consistently over the last 2 years, and there's an element of calculated risk in doing that. But of course, we're also making use of the kinds of pictures that your organisation provides and others provide to us, because it would be foolish not to do. The story would be less complete if we weren't doing that as well. And
invariably, the crowd are everywhere, and the news organizations aren't. There is a limit to where news organizations can reach to in all the corners of the world, and there is actually no limit to where the crowd is based around the world. And now, obviously, with the opportunities they now have to disseminate and spread that news, I think what's interesting is obviously then how do I tap into that? How do I best harness the crowd and use the information that they're providing? We see now and again, the crowd are constantly scooping the news in terms of breaking it, but as we've talked about here, the news organizations will then play that vital role in verifying it and then providing the context and the ongoing story behind that. And I think there's been some interesting work done. Actually, there's a number of particularly news agencies are doing some very good work in the space. Obviously, BBC are doing a lot of fantastic things with Twitter. And there's one tool that was being recently developed in the US called Data Miner for News. And they've done this exclusively with CNN for the first few months, and they'll be rolling it out later. And that is they're looking at patterns around, so they've analyzed breaking news events of the last number of years, and they're able to identify patterns in tweeting behavior which would indicate that there is a breaking news story evolving. So this isn't based on keywords, it's actually based on patterns of tweeting. And so these are some of the tools that a news organization can then use to speed up that process of finding things as they're happening around the world.
I think also a very concrete example is from Sweden, where the largest newspaper sort of implemented the tool of live streaming into their application and then asking the users that they sort of trust a little bit more and asking the user to share their locations. So if something happens and you are with your phone in that location, you actually get a notification on your phone saying, hey, could you pick up your phone and start a live broadcast from here to sort of produce those kind of scenarios.
Benjamin, you.
I'd like to take this discussion of the crowd versus the editor to a different level, because at the moment it's very much like the versus discussion, who's better, who's more important, or who plays which kind of role. And this is very much about sort of, held on a business sort of level. But if you look onto sort of the other way, sort of from the traditional news organizations into the crowd, you see a very different and very positive development. Because if you look at bigger news organizations, they have the biggest social media followings, by all means. I think we don't have to discuss that. I think the very positive effect about this relationship is that information, news, content is disseminated by lots of people in areas that can traditionally, because of censorship or other means, not consume the content that news companies are producing. And we see that, we see that in the Middle East, we see that in Russia, where the content, the old and the new media sort of are producing, is being disseminated by social media. And I think this is an enormous, it's an extremely powerful effect that social media has, because it disseminates knowledge through technology, and thereby sort of pushing democratization efforts much, much, much faster than all other sort of long sort of lobbying and so on would ever take. So I think it's really the togetherness here that is most important.
Just one thing, as an investigative journalist, one of the things that we've done is we've been looking at the American Air Force Base in Ramstein, and one of the things that you can do is you can actually look at what Twitter feeds are coming out of that geographical area, and it's actually quite interesting who's saying what. But Richard.
Well, I don't disagree with that, but I go back to kind of old media and say shortwave radio does that quite well as well, actually.
Yeah, sure.
And we still have a lot of people who come to us listening to shortwave radio in a very traditional way, and people who may not have much other choice. They may not have access to social media, possibly, and getting a trusted source of information to them through those means is still a perfectly valid way of reaching people, albeit given the way that technology is changing, a declining number overall. What I would say is there is something very important here about being able to spot trends and stories earlier through making use of what the audience is saying publicly, whether that's social media or whatever. And that is something that I think is a very important area for us to explore more. It's something we've been working quite hard at. We have a program which runs on TV, radio, and online called Trending, which is trying to surface some of these stories a bit earlier. And so it's interesting to see how the story of the missing girls in Nigeria has become a kind of global media story over the past few days. But that's something that we've been digging away at for the full 3 weeks since it happened, actually. And I think we are able to use the kind of information that's coming through to us as a way of spotting things a bit earlier and being able to do our more traditional job perhaps a bit quicker and maybe with a bit more understanding of what the audience really expects us to be doing, and not, as it were, simply following the media crowd, everybody doing the same thing at the same time. So I think that's quite an important area to notice.
Yeah, I mean, we forget that a lot of traditional radio, especially the CBC's As It Happens, which its trademark was to kind of just call up someone, who's standing in front of the house that's burning down, and that actually is kind of the predecessors of Twitter and Bambuser.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's interesting. We're discussing a lot of very traditional ways of working within journalism, but applying them with technology and the new ways of being in contact with your audience that we just haven't had before. I suppose going back to one of Rowan's points, though, that Twitter and others are fantastically good breaking news platforms, but that's not necessarily the place where the mass audience is going to consume it. The speed at which people are adopting Twitter is variable in different countries around the world. So although we are using that platform ourselves as a breaking news platform, again, just repeat the point I made at the very beginning, it's not the whole story, it's part of the story.
Definitely agree. I think that's why we see ourselves so complementary to news organizations, because you're not going to tell an FAZ, Stern, BBC story, whatever it is, in 140 characters, and so obviously that is a teaser in many ways for the news then to serve that whole big picture behind that tweet, and so that's why you see a lot of tweets become also embedded in the story, and a tweet may become, the starting point of the story, but then you'll get the whole context and the analysis on top of that. So yeah, it's a very complementary relationship.
It's the same for us. Our main focus is a lot around building those technical tools for editors, so they in real time can look at areas of which videos are popping up, or checking them through, making their validation correctly, and sort of helping them designing and building that kind of tools for them.
So we all agree that everyone that it's all complementary and everything works together. I'm curious if the audience we're interested in taking some questions. So if you be curious if there's people who have a different opinion about the crowd versus the editor. We have a question in the back.
Yeah, whoever came up with the title of this talk.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Wiegold. I'm a journalist specializing in defense and security affairs. Sorry, I have to move because I have this. I can't listen to myself with a delay. All right, Thomas Wiegold, specializing in defense and security affairs. A short comment and 2 questions. First, to the host. The satellite pictures you mentioned had been published by NATO itself on the ACO website, so it's a little bit strange to say they distanced itself from it. But maybe we could clear that afterwards. Question to the BBC. You mentioned the importance of shortwave radio, which I agree, I'm a big fan of shortwave radio. So I'm asking myself, why do you cut shortwave radio emissions? I can't get any BBC World Service on my shortwave radio in Europe anymore, probably in Africa or so, but you just omit certain regions from this rather important medium. And a question to Vice. I'm running a website also on defense affairs, and I linked to your video from Gao in Mali last year. You probably remember this 2-part series. And I have a readership which is quite a lot military, ex-military, people who are into the affair. And in the comment section, they said, well, if I look at these pictures, where this cameraman stood, I wouldn't do it. And I'd been a paratrooper or special forces or whatever. So are you taking risks? I'm cut off, no. Are you taking risks that traditional media outlets like the BBC are not willing to take because they look that their people are properly trained for such situations, have the proper kit, and you say, well, we got young, hungry people who go into war. Thank you.
Thomas Wiegold has an amazingly great website about defense issues in Germany, and I can really recommend that everyone look at. I think in terms of if we could deal with the BBC.
Yeah, okay. It's a quick answer, really.
And then go to Vice.
As I said, the shortwave audiences around the world are in decline. Given that we have to make our budgets add up, we focus shortwave on the places where we think people will listen to us. So that's much more in the developing world than it is in Europe, where if you want to listen to the BBC World Service, and I'd be very happy if you did so, you can do so online. And I don't think there's probably a single person in this room that does not have the ability to listen to the World Service online. In fact, if you're in Berlin, you can also listen to us on FM as well, as it happens. So actually, it's about being the most efficient in your means of delivery for the market that you're trying to reach.
People are very sensitive about the change in Berlin from the old BBC line to the new one.
And people don't like change.
But Benjamin, in terms of the important question he asked about, should that have been filmed or not filmed?
I think the question was more about how much risk we're taking. And to answer your question, whenever we go into a high-risk environment, we work together with global security companies to ensure the safety of our correspondents and cameramen. The last thing that we want is that one of our employees is harmed. And we might have a more immersive approach. We are closer to the people. We want to get first-hand accounts, because this is how we tell our stories. But what we do not do is, because of that, because of the style of our reporting, risk the safety of our employees. So to answer your question, we're not and will never be taking unnecessary risk.
Okay, I can explain afterwards about the NATO pictures, but just real briefly, that's what they told us on the phone when we called them, the NATO press office, that those images were not vetted and they posted them anyway. Other questions? But in terms of risks from Twitter feeds, I mean, have you run into that issue in your work?
In what sense, risks?
Well, I mean, here we're talking about someone in front of, in a dangerous situation, a journalist in a dangerous situation doing video footage. It's not an issue for you guys in the same way, or what can you say about that?
I mean, obviously, I mean, we have various things. We have, for instance, journalists get verified on our platforms. You have a verification badge, so that enables people to know this is definitely a journalist. So that's maybe one of the ways in which we can possibly help to protect, in a sense, or to prove the identity of a journalist. That may go in some way, but otherwise, I think there the crowd plays a role, as Simon Ostrovsky, that the news came out on Twitter. In fact, actually, I remember Dirk Emmerich, reporter for NTV, for instance, was also taken to jail for a few hours when he was reporting, not in Ukraine, I don't want to misquote, I think it was Egypt, but I have to follow up on that. But certainly I remember him live tweeting that experience and then sending out a tweet at the end of it saying that actually Twitter may have been one of the reasons he was let out so early, because they realized he was creating a global story out of this.
Yeah, there was Medea Benjamin also had a similar situation like that in Gaza, or no, I think in an Egyptian prison recently, where that was being live. She was tweeting live from her jail cell. But I mean, are you encouraging people to do dangerous things? I mean,
definitely not. We're trying not to encourage them, but it is. I mean, it is horrifying with videos of people running around in homes, for example, and bombs are falling. They're keeping a live stream up for 45 minutes. You're sitting in real time, chatting with them, and they're speaking back, and you're having that dialogue. And boom, 45 minutes in, it goes black, and the day after we hear from activists around them that the person actually was killed, right? So those moments are, of course, horrifying, but they are taking their risk because they really want the world to know what's going on.
Okay,
But I think it's a decisive line, right? We cannot handle that kind of risk.
there's a question here.
My name is Marcus Ekstad of KCM. I have a quick question around also the title of this discussion. I think there have been some comments made, the crowd versus the editor. A lot of the panelists have said they don't see it as a versus situation. I wonder, though, in listening to Mons Adler, whether the panelists would agree or disagree that this crowdsourced content, whether it's through Bambuser or Twitter, is actually becoming a source of news content in its own right, much like AP is or Reuters is for companies like the BBC. And I wonder if that's something that the panelists would agree with, and whether they are engaging with that new source of content, maybe in a similar way that they engage with the established sources of content.
I mean, just quickly, one of our investors is Associated Press. So those are, I think we are the third company in their 150 years that they ever invested in, but that's the approach that they are having. So.
Yeah, and I think in terms of Twitter, as I said, we see it as, obviously a lot of people do come to Twitter to find out what's happening in the world, what's happening in their world, what's happening in real time, and obviously for myself as well. Twitter has been for many years my primary source of news. But what that means actually is I go into my feed that is curated by the people that I follow, and I have a ton of links. And in fact, I have a much more diverse way of reading the news, and I visited a lot of many different sites, maybe a lot more than I used to. And what we're seeing actually around the world, and is, for instance, in the US, a lot of the big news sites are getting double digits figures, percentage of their total traffic coming from Twitter. So we're really driving a lot of traffic back.
But I think there is a big sort of social emotional layer onto what we called, or what you used to call, news today, right? The whole Facebook news feed isn't about reading what Britney Spears did last week, but it's reading about what my friends did last week. So and then tapping into that is very beautiful, right? It weighs up as a human being. I rather want to see my best friend playing his Division 5 soccer game than maybe I want to see the top Premier League club playing, right? So because there is a way larger social emotional layer and value in that.
Richard.
Well, I think that point about curating is quite important here, about kind of self-selecting, because of course if you use Twitter as your source of news, you've previously made a choice about the people or the organizations you want to hear news from. And I think that raises some quite big questions for us in more traditional media organizations, where the basis of the services we provide is we sort of, in television, we give you a rundown, we give you a selection of the stories that we think are the ones that you're going to be interested in, and on our websites, there's you can choose the ones you want, but there's sort of everything there in front of you, or everything that we can get that's there in front of you, and that is, I think that is going to shift things more dramatically in the future, and I think we'll see much more ability on our websites and our digital platforms for people to do the same thing, to select the things that they're interested in, to have a version of the BBC website that matches their choices and their interests. That, for me, raises yet further questions, which is, how do you know what you're interested in? And I still think that there's going to be a very large audience for quite a long time to come that wants to be given kind of our best guess at what we think is the selection of stories that we think are relevant or significant or useful to you. And I think there's a very big role to play there. And just to finish off that point, what that also means for an organization like ours is that we have to be playing in all of these areas all at the same time. We still have to produce very high quality 30-minute television news bulletins for the audience that wants that. We have to produce a very comprehensive desktop website that offers all the things that people who go to that want to get, and we have to offer mobile services which are maybe more personalized, and enable you to choose the things that you want. And we have to do all of those things, and that's, in a way, the really big challenge that we face.
There's a question in the back. There's a question in the back, but I just wanted to say, I mean, one of the things that I find amazing about Twitter is the whole phenomenon of the echo chamber. That, I mean, when you subscribe to basically everyone who you agree with, I mean, that's always been a problem with media, right? That you subscribe to the newspaper that you agree with, as opposed to, getting. But it is true that in bigger media or at BBC, you are getting a bigger variety of things to hear. But the question in the back. What was? Oh, the question's over. Okay. Okay.
I mean, to take your point on the filter bubble and saying, you obviously choose to follow who you follow. One thing I think that's different to a newspaper that you buy and you just get that point of view from the newspaper is that people that I follow, I often don't know what their political views are, etc. And also they'll retweet things that will suddenly end up in my timeline that I didn't, for instance, follow. So actually, you're getting a much more diverse perspective.
Sure, but I mean, it's stunning the world that's out there, for example, of Christian right tweets in the United States that never enters my feed. Do you know? I mean, there's a huge world of people very active on Twitter talking about how abortion is murder. I mean, there's that, and it's just amazing to see what different worlds there really are on Twitter.
Yep.
There's a question.
There's a question.
I would like to, my name is Wolf. I would like to take your point by another direction, because you talk always about the crowd, as you say, as a part of the environment of the journalist doing. I would like to understand better how you use your audience and their reaction, because they are not just the crowd which gives you extra access to your news feed. I would like to better understand how you analyze the reaction of your readers, your people who use the information, how they think about what they are reading. Have you any tools which allows you to better understand what your reading audience or your listening audience or your viewing audience actually is thinking or feeling about what they have been seeing, and how do you use that? Thank you.
Richard. Or Benjamin, excuse me.
I think that's the beauty of social media, and we very much incorporated this sort of feedback channel into our ways of working, because these days, through the liberalization through technology, it's not a top-down process where back in the days the chief editor, the program director decided, then they put something out there and they looked at the ratings or the sales numbers and so on. And here and there was a letter coming in complaining. These days, an active dialogue between the editor and the audience. And I think this is where the real power lies in sort of the collaboration between the two, is that editors better understand their audiences and have ways of communicating with them constantly, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and creating, in a true sense, what possibly democracy is, really all about. It's about, public opinion, and that's the beauty of social media.
Richard.
Well, I agree with that, but kind of up to a point, because I think it would also be probably wrong to conclude that what you get in response to a story you publish is in itself the audience reaction, because actually all you're getting is the reaction of those people who feel inclined enough to put their comments in and who happen to have access to the right piece of technology at the time to do that. So it's part of it, but it's not everything. And I kind of keep coming back to that point in a way. I mean, having said that, it's still really important for us. So, for example, a correspondent maybe specializing in business or science or whatever, they haven't really had this opportunity in the past to get instant feedback from members of the audience to something they've published, and that is valuable, and we should take note of that. And so the simplest thing we can do is just read what people say. I think what we don't do very much of is then read that on air, because I'm not sure that it's very useful for the audience to sort of hear what somebody said on Facebook. That's not something we do much of. One last thing to say is that, again, just through using technology, there's a lot more we can do. So we measure sentiment, as it were, on social media. So if we want to know what people think of a BBC program or of a story, you know, there are ways of using software to analyze the kind of language that people are using on social media platforms and get a better feel for what the audience thinks overall. So, and I think we'll see more and more of that as time develops, actually.
I think it's interesting also sort of to see how especially Twitter and also in our case, how sort of the crowd or the users or the viewers actually are getting to a point also. We have a couple of use cases where live streams coming out of Egypt, for example, only Arabic-speaking people sending the, you know, broadcasting. There's a journalist in the UK asking questions in English, and the person doesn't understand, but there is another viewer coming in, translating into Arabic. The person understands the question, the response, talking back in Arabic, and then the person in the chat, speaking both English and Arabic, translates back to the journalist. Of course, there's a lot of moments where it could go, you know, terribly wrong, sure. but it's still that kind of active movement that is kind of interesting to see as well, where those lines very much blur out and adding things to the story.
Did you want to address that, or do you? Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Sounds good.
just very limited time. Any other last questions? Wait, we have a question. Can't see. Okay, here we go.
One over there.
So, being a journalist myself, I'm always a bit worried about content quality. Also with like editors and the crowd collaborating. So, how can we, what do you think, ensure that we have high quality content coming out of all that collaboration? Because as a journalist, you have like a code of conduct and certain quality standards. Does the crowd have those as well, or is there some kind of self-regulation with them?
Who would like to answer that question?
I agree with you 100%. It's sort of an extremely difficult area. What is quality, journalistic quality? You know, there needs to be the education, there needs to be a code of conduct, there needs to be sort of a production quality, and so on and so forth. So quality traditionally is ensured by news agencies. But there's a very interesting development to be seen in countries that do not have sort of a journalistic environment, where there are no schools, where information was sort of disseminated by ministries for information. What you see there is that through the power of you know, digital distribution and content, that in these countries the quality of produced content by the public is rising. So you more and more see sort of self-educated journalists who sort of inform themselves from the outside of their country and start producing better quality content. And Syria was a great example. The first videos you saw were all handy videos, mobile phone videos. But moving on, after a year's time, you started to see sort of first properly produced, self-produced videos that, and not talking about the agenda they were trying to push forward, but you saw that people were being educated through you know, dissemination of information and content from around the world. So I do understand your thinking, but at the same time, there's also very positive development around the world that journalism is getting better through technology.
One last question, anyone? Okay.